in a city called Yathrib and other places. Christians and Jews and Arabs call their deity by the same name, Allah. So their chief deity, the creator deity, was known by Allah as Allah by all, and as is known by Christian Arabs and Christian Jews, Christian Arabs and Jewish Arabs until today call God as Allah. So if you were to look at an Arabic translation of the Bible, the New Testament or the Old Testament, you'll find that God is translated as Allah. So this is a world that is extremely religious. And it shares a deity, but it finds different ways to solve the problem, if you will, of the seeming distance of God. So the Arabs think that these territorial deities, the limited deities that they have, they are intermediaries between them and the creator God, Allah. God is distant, he is creator of everything, but why would he listen to me or my tribe? So these deities solve that problem. Now, when Prophet Muhammad begins to preach, his message is very simple. There is no God, there is no deity but Allah. And I am God's messenger. I am speaking on behalf of Allah. So this begins the journey, which is a 23-year-long mission of the Prophet Muhammad. So for the first 13 years, he preaches in his town in Mecca. A number of people convert, about 100 or so, and he is persecuted. Many people that join him are poor, slaves, women, downtrodden, young. But those who are in power finally or ultimately unite against him, and he is forced to flee to a nearby land, Yathrib, which then becomes known as Medina. So that is where Prophet Muhammad then preaches the next 10 years of his life, and that is when his message is established. So what are his teachings? Let me capture the teachings of Muhammad as he taught him through a story that in fact is recorded in Muslim sources. Once Muhammad is sitting with his companions. Now this is Arabia, an egalitarian society. People are all equal. So Muhammad's disciples are called companions or friends. So Muhammad is sitting with his companions or friends, and a strange man arrives, dressed immaculately, beautifully, which surprises everyone because a stranger who doesn't have a house nearby cannot possibly be so well dressed and look, because if you traveled in the desert, you looked dusty. So this man comes out of nowhere, sits right next to Prophet Muhammad, touching his knees to the knees of the Prophet Muhammad, and says, "Oh Muhammad, tell me, what is Islam?" And Muhammad says, Islam, literally the word Islam is submission or surrender to God. So Muhammad said, Islam is that you testify that there is no God but one God, as Muhammad is a messenger of God, and that you pray and fast and give alms to the poor and make pilgrimage to Mecca. Do these 5 things. Then the man says, you have spoken the truth. And everybody's surprised that this man, stranger, comes to the prophet who is teaching this religion and asks a question and then acts as if he knows the answer, and Muhammad got it right. And then the man asks the next question, tell me now, what is faith? And Muhammad says, faith is that you believe in Allah and his prophets, all of his prophets, the last day, angels, God's books that he has sent, and that God has power over all things, good and bad. The man then asks a third question and says, tell me, what is beauty? And Muhammad says, beauty is that you worship God as if you are in his presence. Because even though you don't see God, he sees you. So the man then asks the fourth question, when is the hour? When is the end? And Muhammad says, the one who's asking, or the one who's being asked, knows no more than the one who's doing the asking. Then the man asks his fifth and final question, saying, tell me some signs of the hour, of when it all ends. And Muhammad said some mysterious things, such as when desert dwellers compete in building tall buildings, wait for the hour. When a slave girl gives birth to her mistress, wait for the hour. And when you see killing, when the killer does not know why he's killing and the one who's being killed does not know why he is being killed, wait for the hour. And then the man gets up and leaves. And Muhammad turns to his companions and says, do you know who this was? And they said, no, we don't, no clue. And so Muhammad says, this was the angel, the archangel Gabriel, who came to teach you your religion. So this is known as a story or hadith of Gabriel. The story of Gabriel tells us the essential questions in Islam. The first answer, if you look at the first question, how to submit to God, how to live a life that is in submission to God, the answer was, what are the things that you do? You declare that there is only one God and accept Muhammad as a messenger. And you pray and fast and give alms, and if you can make pilgrimage, do so. The second question was, what is your life of faith? What do you believe? What do you know to be true? And Muhammad tells him that the answer to that of what is in your mind, that is, what do you think and how do you think about the world? What is it that you know? That is, that you know God is true, and angels are true, and prophets are true, and the day of judgment, and that God is omnipotent. God has power over all things, whether they're good or bad. And then the third question is, the first one has to do with doing things, and second one has to do with knowing things, but the third one has to do with loving things. How do you make things beautiful so that they're lovely? How do you live a life as a believer, as a faithful person, as a Muslim, that is beautiful, that is loved by God and loved by his creation? You live as if you see God. You live as if you are in the presence of God. And then the fourth and the final question adds a new dimension to life, which is time. And that How is time going to unfold? And Muhammad's answer to that is, I don't know when the hour comes. And this, of course, refers to the Day of Judgment. Muhammad does not know when the Day of Judgment has come, but God has told him some signs. And there are many other signs that he gives in other reports elsewhere. So this gives you a nice summary of what is it to be doing things, what to know things, and what is it that a Muslim is supposed to strive to do. So let me mention a few key things of all of what I've said to focus on, and then I'm going to be happy to take questions on any of the rest of them. So the first and most important teaching in Islam is monotheism, and as is well known, Islamic monotheism is very demanding in the sense that it does not admit of intermediaries or any other representations of God, so that Jesus is not a God, but a messenger of God, a prophet of God. Muhammad would speak of Jesus as his brother. He would say that my brother Jesus said this, just as he would say my brother Moses. So let me then, so monotheism, one God who should be the absolute center of one's worship, of one's love, and one attains this monotheism, this total oneness of God, by not only knowing that there is only one God who created and who will, who hears and listens and who is compassionate and all-knowing and all good and all-powerful, but you think about only one God, and you think about the world as a creation of God. So everything that you see is a co-creation, and therefore you cannot and ought not to exploit it or take it for granted. Everything that is in the heavens and the earth, the Quran declares numerous times, praises God. Everything that, whether it's animate or inanimate, is praising God, and therefore one cannot take anything for granted, even inanimate things or animals, let alone other humans. How do you become good with that one God? That's a question that often my Christian students and friends ask, that, do you have that concept of grace, or is it only works? And in fact, what you have in Islam is a balance between works and grace. But ultimately, it is grace that earns you God's good grace, is a good place with God, not your works. So you do works only to show your devotion. There is a saying of Muhammad that captures this well. Muhammad said to his companions, no one will enter heaven except with God's mercy and compassion. That is God's amnesty and mercy. And his companions said, not even you, O messenger of God. Right? Muhammad is considered the best human being, and the highest and the noblest. And so Muhammad says, not even I. No one, including me, will enter heaven without God's mercy, not by your own works. And so why do you do good works? You do good works because God is just and God looks at your works, but God is not limited by your works. In other words, God is not, you don't have a business deal with God that God will weigh your actions and see if you have paid the price of heaven, but rather God would look at how much you tried and loved and had faith. And faith in Islam is embodied, meaning that it is what you feel and what you do rather than what you say that counts. Well, what you say also counts, but not the simple empty claim, but how you live. So that's why doing things for God is part of faith, one shows. But grace ultimately, that is God's mercy, it decides everything, including your feeling of love. But ultimately, this mystery of where our faith comes from, that ultimately is for God to know and God to give. All right, so now let me say a few things more specifically about the next point of the three main points I want to make: monotheism, prophethood, and afterlife. So we talked about monotheism and Islam's emphasis on one God. Let me say something about prophethood, that God reaches out to humanity, reaches out to human beings through human beings who are inspired by God against their will and against their own merit. They don't earn to be spoken to by God. They're chosen by God, and they become the conduit through which God speaks to humanity. God sent many, many other prophets before. In one report, Muhammad said there were 124,000 prophets. So everyone throughout the world, all people, received prophets. And so it is not only the Arabs or the Jews or the Semitic people or people over in the Near East or the Middle East, but everyone had their prophets. However, God chose of all the prophets and Abraham, and then after Abraham, numerous prophets were sent in the progeny of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, and in Isaac's progeny many. Moses and Jesus are great prophets in the line of Isaac, and Muhammad is the only prophet in the line of Ishmael. But Muhammad is the final prophet. Finally, on the afterlife, that's another big one. Afterlife is a big deal because the Arabs, as well as other religions in Arabia, did not have a clear concept of afterlife. The Christians, of course, had a notion of afterlife, so did the Jews, but as far as we know, historically, Arab Jews thought of afterlife differently, but not a very clear sense. So this was a big teaching of Islam in Arabia, and has been, that this life is not real. It is simply a test, not a punishment, but a test to see how we're going to fare in the eternal afterlife with God. That if we do good in this life, then we are rewarded, and if we don't, then we are penalized. We are held accountable individually. So it's our actions, not the actions of our family or whoever we may choose as our religious guide or saint, that matter. Religious guides guide us, but we must make the right choices and will be held accountable individually before God. So those are the three main teachings that sort of sum up much of what I said earlier. One God, prophethood, and an afterlife. Now let me cap this with some of the teachings of Muhammad that are very commonly known to Muslims and that really guide the day-to-day lives of Muslims. There was a woman, a bad character, the tradition has it, prostitute, who lived a decadent life, but once she's traveling a desert and is extremely thirsty, and she sees a well, and the bottom of the well there is just enough water for her to quench her thirst. She goes down, and as she's about to drink that water, she hears a dog panting up above. And out of this mercy, she takes her shoe and fills it with the water and brings it up, has nothing else, and gives that water to the dog, and the dog drinks it. And God loves her act so much that God forgives her for giving water to a dog, to a dog. And another woman who is known for her piety and her worship to God, but she's known to be a mean woman to her neighbors. And she has a cat that she mistreats. Once she leaves her home for a few days, but ties the cat inside, doesn't let it go out. By the time she comes back, the cat has starved to death. Muhammad said that woman will be punished in hell for that cat. So a woman, so in other words, the message of these stories is appearances are deceiving. That in fact, it's a compassion in your heart for the creation and your trust in God. Those are things that really count, and that can change all the other things that you do. And so one should always live in this loving fear of God. One loves God and one fears God in the way that that shows one's constant devotion, that one shows that God is always there, God is always powerful, God is always watching. So those are some of the fundamental teachings of Islam that are sort of present to Muslims. And I think that with that, I will open the floor for questions for the next 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Darla, do we have any questions?
None yet.
Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, well, I'll wait for a few minutes, and if there aren't any, I will go on to my next topic until our break time.
Ed has a question for you.
Hi, Overmere. Good to see you.
Hi.
One of the things that Islam's changed. Are you going to go over that? How it's changed and how it's remained the same through the centuries? Can you give us like a encapsulation of how it's stayed the same since the beginning and how it's changing, perhaps? Just a snapshot, if you're not going to cover it.
Okay, yeah, no, I can talk about it, certainly. So, Islam was encapsulated earlier on in a book, the Quran, which were the revelations given to Muhammad, and they were written down fairly quickly. In his lifetime, they are not compiled. They are in different sort of scrolls. They didn't have a written culture, but within a few decades of after his death, they're compiled well, within 2 years of his death, they're compiled but not standardized, and then within decades they're compiled and standardized, and that is the Quran, and that is memorized and said in prayers. So that's sort of the foundational text and foundation of the Quran, but also the stories about what Muhammad did and said, that is hadith. Those are two things. And those are two things that remain constant over time. But their understanding and, their compilation and their scholarship that is based on them, that has, of course, evolved over time. And so there are numerous, of course, Islam spread from being a religion in Mecca in a stateless society, very, very simple society, to very quickly, within 30 years, it became the religion of much more advanced societies in Syria and Iraq and Persia. And it became an urban religion very quickly. And there, over time, it evolved in many ways. One of the things that has evolved in Islam is politically, Islam began as a very egalitarian religion, but of course, pretty soon the empires are established. And as those empires are established, religion now is there is tension between the scholarly class, the ulama, scholars, and the rulers. And there is a slight difference, and it's a nice point that can be contrasted to Christianity. Whereas in Christianity, it's a religion that is suppressed for some 3 centuries, and then it gets picked up by the pagan empire that then embraces Christianity, and then the political upheavals and sectarianism begins whenever power is involved. But in Islam, the conquest comes right away after Muhammad's death, within 30 years. And at first, that caliphate, as it's called, or the empire, which is successorship to Muhammad, that's all it means. That is a very egalitarian and just system, but pretty soon it becomes an empire, as empires are, and the Muslim societies then develop a way to live without too much involvement of those in power. And that is when the ulama, the scholarly class, becomes central. And scholars in Islam, just to give you a contrasting sense, are slightly different. Say they're not priests as in historical Christianity, say in Catholicism, and they're kind of like Jewish rabbis in that they in fact study the law and teach the law, but they also are concerned with inner matters of spirituality and ethics. So in that sense, they're somewhere in the middle, but these ulama then become the center point of Islam. That's how vast majority of people have known Islam. So that's one change over time. Now, various groups of ulama, various sects have developed, and the most important split that occurred is between Sunni and Shia. And I know some of you are going to ask me that question, so I might as well dive into it. So Sunni and Shia, literally the word Shia means partisans of Ali. Ali is the son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad and his cousin. And over time, that is not immediately after him. Some of this is later back projected. It didn't happen at the time, but there is as basically Islam, the empire becomes more worldly, people react against the empire and want to bring the golden period of this great piety and righteousness and justice back. And there are different formulas found to bring that early golden age back. And one of them is that, well, things have gone wrong because the ruler is not the right ruler. The ruler needs to be from the family of Muhammad. And since Muhammad did not have a son, his son-in-law and cousin is the closest thing. And we need to find a ruler from the family of that son-in-law. His name is Ali. So the family of Ali is, and one man in the family of Ali in every generation is the right man for the job of ruling the Muslims, but not only ruling as in political ruling, but ruling them like the Prophet ruled them, teaching them and ruling them and taking care of them and ensuring that they're on the right path and so on. And this group became known as the Shia. Now, this is a minority. The majority is Sunni, and today that's about 85% of Muslims. And the Sunni view from the beginning was that the cup is half full, that in fact, this life is not supposed to be perfect, but there is no perfect man. There is no one who is infallible after Muhammad. So the family of the Prophet is honorable and is beloved, but they are not infallible. There is no such thing as an infallible man who will continue to guide until the end of time. So that's the difference, if you will, both a political and a theological difference. It's political because it's about leadership, but it's really also theological because it's about the righteous leadership of the community. It's about how to go back to the era of justice and equality and piety when people did not oppress each other and as in the early 30 or 40 years after Muhammad. So that is seen as a golden era. And that is, if you will, the foundational story that gives birth to this split.
Thanks, Obamir. You've given a lot of wonderful information, and my sense is you could go on for a good bit longer on this question, but I'm noticing there are 3 or 4 other people that have questions as well. So if I may defer and so that they can bring their questions, would that be all right with you?
Yes, of course, please.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed. Our next question is from Jeff Gerber.
Good morning. Salam. We have a couple of
Salam.
questions. One question. You speak of grace, which we heard you say that the grace is in the dispensation or the revelation of what God wants through God's prophets. Okay, but then the 2 illustrations you gave of the woman who gave the dog a drink, and of the seemingly pious woman who was a pain to her neighbors. Is there any concept of forgiveness in heaven, or are we still ultimately judged? If we're judged by what we do here, is that the final story? You know what I mean? So
Right,
anyway,
right.
Sir, thank you.
Yeah. So these stories are often moral and rhetorical. So they're when the prophet says this person is in hell, it does not mean they're in hell eternally. That could sometimes just mean that this action is the action of going to hellfire, but they may be forgiven. So forgiveness is a major theme in Islam. Of course, this is the merciful is the dearest name of God, and God forgives all types of sins, all things. The Quran says that God will forgive any sin except for associating partners to God. That's one sin that is not forgivable. But even that is forgivable if one asks for forgiveness. Other sins may be forgiven even when we become penitent, but not quite even ask for forgiveness or don't deserve it. So that's a really good question. So when Prophet Muhammad said the woman who punishes or starves her cat to death and is mean, when she's in hell, it doesn't mean she's in hell forever. There is a concept that is parallel to the concept of purgatory, meaning that it may be that some people go to hell for a little bit and they're purified of some of the really evil things they did, but and then they go to heaven.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Tom Keggy.
Hi, Overmere.
Hi, Tom.
I am sorry, I have to leave for a medical appointment here in a few minutes, so my question might actually be more appropriate in the second half, but since I only have right now to ask the question, I'm going to go ahead with it. You talked about compassion for creation and compassion being central to Islamic belief, if I understood you correctly.
Right.
And yet most of white America seems to be very distrustful and fearful of Islam.
Right.
And they see the violence, particularly in the Middle East, and they become, unfortunately, hateful towards the Muslim people. How do we talk with these folks in ways that promote peace and trust among these important faith traditions?
Right. It's a great question. I'll get a chance to elaborate on that later. But so there are different ways of answering that question. One is that compassion is central to religion, but just as, I mean, one, of course, if you look at simply the fact that charity is central to Christianity, but are all Christians charitable? And the same is true of Islam, that people don't follow their religion. And there is a lot of evidence that even people who, in fact, have been engaged, for example, in terrorism, the Muslims who were involved in 9/11 and whatnot, that they, in fact, had secular reasons that had to do with revenge rather than religion. That, in fact, if you look at the people, so for example, there was a survey done by Gallup poll in 2001 through 2007 of all major Muslim countries, 10 major Muslim countries, of the greatest poll or the largest poll of its kind ever done. And there they asked a number of questions, really extensive. And one of the things was, how many people think that it's okay to kill civilians or non-combatants? And that number was also compared to the number of people in the United States who said the same thing. And in the United States, the number of people who said it's okay to kill combatants was more than the number of people who said in the Muslim world overall that it's okay to kill combatants. So that number is about 7%, by the way, both in the United States and in the Muslim world, it's about 6.5%. And if you look at what most of those people who do say that this kind of violence is okay, the reasons that they give, and this is a Gallup poll that's still available online, I believe, they say the reasons have to do with colonialism, reasons have to do with United States occupation of this, or what the British and the French did in the early part of the 20th century, where they killed massacre. I mean, millions and millions of Muslims were killed. And what was done in Iraq, for example, is, this famous story of which really was shocking to Muslims, when Madeleine Albright, our Secretary of State, was asked whether 500,000 children killed in Iraq between 2001 and 1991 and 1997 or 96 was acceptable, and for the policy, which hasn't really resulted in any good. At that time, they're trying to unseat Saddam Hussein. And she said, yes, we think it was worth it. I mean, imagine someone saying that 500,000 children, Iraqi children, that was a UN number, actual number is much higher, and the total number of people was 2 million by the UN account. And that is what creates the sense of anger in those people. It is not, so in most cases, in vast majority of cases, they don't give a verse from the Quran that, oh, we are angry because the Quran says go kill this and that, right? In fact, the Quran doesn't say that. We're going to look at that Quran, in fact, says that you can, that anyone who is not actively hostile to you, that you must be, the word that is used is benevolent, that you must be charitable toward them, pagans or Jews or Christians or anybody else. And so terrorism, which is this real serious scourge, but it's one that should be understood in the same way that you could understand Timothy McVeigh, for example. That it's really when, you know, as Americans, as a Muslim American, I never confuse Timothy McVeigh with you guys or with Christians in general, any branch of Christianity, unless it becomes, if there are some, of course, there may be extremely marginal sects that teach that kind of stuff. And the same thing is true when you have political breakdown, failed states, when you have people angry, they feel marginalized, and they don't have a way to express legitimate problems, you get a lot more of those groups. In the United States, let's hope and pray to God that that remains the case, that we have legitimate ways to express our grievances, political grievances, social and economic grievances. But in the Middle East, we don't have that. And the reason we don't have that has to do with 200 years of colonialism in that part of the world, which most Americans are not familiar with, which is why it's difficult for us to appreciate why it is that so many governments there are breaking down. But in a word, the answer is that it's a political problem. I hope that
excellent answer. Thank you. Excellent answer. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. I know it's difficult to answer that briefly, but thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Ad, for that reference. Who Speaks for Islam by Esposito and Mogahed by Gallup Press in 2007. Yep, that's the book that came out on the basis of that Gallup poll.
Okay. And I believe our last question right now is from Mark Bishop.
Well, it's from Susan Bishop. Hello, Amir. I have a question about women in Muslim faith, historically and today.
Okay. You want to elaborate on that, or do you want me to just?
Well, you talked about how the Shia felt it should be the son-in-law, not the daughter's family, but the son-in-law's family, and that I just was curious about the way it is today too. Is it very male dominated?
So the short answer is that Islamic societies, just like Christian societies and other Greek societies, Hindu societies in the past, have been patriarchal, meaning that family structure accepts the father as the head of the household. That has been the case throughout the world. So I'm not going to comment on much more recent changes, as in the last 100 years, the feminist movement and so on, that has really changed the way that we ask this question. But as a historian, I can, so I want to talk about the 14 centuries rather than 50 years. And Islam was perceived, even by medieval Christians, as exceptionally liberal toward women. In the following sense: Islamic law, the Quranic law, gave women half of inheritance property. The share was half of their brothers, right? So a sister would get half of the share of the brother, but this was a enormous revolutionary change compared to the fact that they were considered property before. They were considered property of the father or the patriarch in Roman law, in Indian law, and you know, if you read Jane Austen's novels, you know that in the West, in Britain, in the United States, but in Britain, for example, a woman could not own property, which is why they all had to get married really quickly. So it was not only in the 19th century and then 20th century that women could own property in the West. Well, that happened 1400 years ago in the Quran, and women can own property. And not only that, but Muslim women, when they get married, there are extensive set of rights that are given in the Quran that include women's right to their property, which the husband does not have right over. So in a marriage, a husband must take care of the finances, the expenses, and the woman in a marriage is not required to contribute financially. And so that financial independence allows her, and historically allowed her independence in a significant way. Medieval Islamic societies, however, sort of, you could say that the older systems prior to Islam influenced the interpretations of Islamic law so that they in fact became increasingly or more stridently patriarchal than the Quranic society and the Prophet society. So there have been these debates within Muslims that, you know, where the Prophet gave so many rights to women, that you find those in the Quran, but those are often, not always, but often in Muslim societies, they don't practice Islamic law and or Islamic norms or Islamic values. So there is no doubt that today in the Muslim world, you have serious violations of of women's rights. But those violations are often far more complicated than they look, right? So, for instance, the United States, nearly a third, more than a third of women are abused. That, of course, that does not mean that that is the value that either the Americans or the Christians hold, but that is the reality, that most women are subjected to abuse, either physical or sexual or otherwise. So what you have in the Muslim world is these traditional forces, conservative forces that are fighting two forces. They're fighting Islamic religious norms, as well as the Western secular norms. And so it's a complex matter. I remember, I guess I'll just, to give you a sense of how complicated things are, I'll give you this anecdote by this British anthropologist who goes to Pakistan, northern Pakistan, one of the most conservative areas. And there he goes to a university and asks this question. So they're both male and female students. And he asks, how many of you would want to, in your domestic and matters and your relations between male and female, men and women, how many of you prefer Islamic law and how many of you prefer the customary law? And all men preferred customary law and all women preferred Islamic law. And that's the real tension, that custom is very strong. Another example of that is FGM, female genital mutilation, which is a problem not in Pakistan, not in Iran, not in most other countries, but in African Muslim countries. So in Egypt, it's a problem. It's a problem in countries in Africa. The reason it's a problem in Africa, in countries like the Sudan and Egypt, is because it is the culture there. So everybody does it. The Christians do it, the animists do it, the Muslims do it, but somehow it becomes associated exclusively with Muslims.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a follow-up question. Do you have anything, in the United Church of Christ, we have women clergy. Is there anything comparable to that?
So the answer to that is complicated because there is no clergy in Islam to begin with. What you have in Islam, if you remember, I talked about scholars, right? So the real force in Islam of authority belongs to scholars. Now, some of those scholars are imams or they're prayer leaders, but the real weight of authority, as in authority to decide religious matters, to guide people, belongs to scholars. And some of those scholars, sort of like at a clerical level, serve to lead prayers. All right. So with that, if that's clear, then the clerical function, if you will, of leading prayer or reciting the Quran out loud, that is something that is reserved only for men. But scholarly function of actually being the authority who can give judgment about what is right and what's wrong, and even what this imam or this prayer leader would have to follow, in that there are both men and women. So there is no restriction on women being scholars. And historically, there have always been scholars, women scholars in Islam. Although even in that, one has to qualify and say the last few centuries, women scholars, the number of women scholars has gone down precipitously. This had something to do with colonialism or even prior to colonialism, but that's a historical question. Contemporary Muslim society, the number of Muslim scholars, Muslim women scholars, has gone up significantly. So now you will find that on most discussions, which are now all on Zoom discussions, most Zoom discussions, you'll find that the number of men and women is about the same, or or almost the same. For those scholars who are giving an opinion on this and that issue.
Okay, thank you so much for your clarification. That helps.
Thanks for the question.
And that is our last question.
All right, and that is a good time to take a break, isn't it?
Yes, I think so.
All right, and so we're going to take a 5-minute break.
Yes, we will take a 5-minute break.
Okay. All right, so
So
let's
we
come
will
back.
be back at 10:45.
10:45 it is.
We are ready to begin again.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Ad, for that addition in the chat. You're right that there are some orders where women would lead prayers. Of course, there are other occasions when women lead prayers, but not only in the U.S. but elsewhere in the Muslim countries. There are sometimes even women-only mosques that are relatively new phenomenon. But there have been Muslim women leaders, prime ministers, queens and empresses in the past. But I think that I speak as a historian. Of course, there are many Muslims today who are very eager to say, well, look, we have had this many women or that woman. But I think that on the whole, as a historian, you find that the pattern is that, like in the rest of the world, in the pre-modern world, men dominated the public sphere, but it is in the household and in family circles where most of life was lived prior to modernity. So you did not have, houses were much of more of a central place in social life than they are now. even politics was done in the house, within the households. So, and there, women played extremely important and powerful role, both as, you know, as wives and as mothers, and so historically, women have played a very important role religiously and even politically and socially. You'll find, for example, if you go to some of the major Muslim cities like Cairo and Damascus, many mosques and universities are in the name of women that established them, because these were women who endowed those universities or libraries or whatnot. And in fact, the oldest university in the world was established by a Moroccan woman. And there are many, many such universities. And that phenomenon of women as either businessmen or businesswomen, and as important members of a ruling family, establishing mosques and hospitals and universities and libraries, that was really the norm until the colonial period in the 19th century, when the society sort of radically changed and so on. So yeah, absolutely, there's a lot of complexity in that. But at the same time, there is no denying the fact that you know, Islam, like Christianity, is a very family-oriented religion, and there is a functional, if you will, not spiritual, but functional difference in functions that is created, because men are supposed to be the providers and protectors of women. That's the Quranic verse. And as such, women do not have to get a job and provide. They have to keep the house. And so that functional difference is there in traditional Islam, but spiritually they are equal before God, and that's the crucial point. And again, it's a very religious society. It's an empire of faith for 1400 years, where economics and social and political things that we know now, just really in the last few decades as being the central, you know, dimensions of life, they were really unimportant and irrelevant. People lived their lives with their eyes fixed on heaven, and that is where people would find their true worth and compete. All right. So I will take another about 20 minutes, and then we'll take another break. And in those 20 minutes, I'll be very open to questions that you may have, even as I'm talking. And then after that break, I'm going to talk about American and the US and the Muslim world, so more contemporary relations between Muslims and the Christian world.
It looks like we have a question already from Doug. Doug,
Okay.
are you with us?
I think you might need to unmute yourself, Doug.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah. Doug, are you muted?
Here we go. Thank you for being here. This is very interesting. In Christianity, at least in the United States, our leaders are chosen a number of different ways, some by educational degrees, some by popular demand. How in your religion are emirs or scholars recognized?
Ah, very good. That's a wonderful question. And I'm assuming you're asking specifically about religious leaders and scholars, not political leaders.
Yes.
Okay. So religiously, Islam, you could say, is a very democratic religion. In the following sense, not democratic, you could say meritocratic, in the sense that you don't have priests, you don't have a class of people that can give out indulgences, right? Nobody, you ask God directly for forgiveness and not not through a priest, which of course is also true for Protestant Christianity. But for a very long time for Christianity, that was not true. And that is, if you're looking at medieval Muslim texts, Muslims are always appalled by what they see in Christianity, this lack of access, direct access to God. And the way one acquires authority in Islam is the same way as how modern university works. Meaning that you, once you have a PhD, right, you have at least formally the same authority as anybody else who has a PhD. But of course, those who acquire a PhD and then go on to publish great research, they acquire much greater authority in their fields, and they become the leaders, and then they become appointed perhaps as professors or as heads of institutions where they have greater authority. So similarly in Islam, there is a process of learning the Quran, the Sunnah, the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, Islamic law. Again, when I use the word law, it means it's something close. It's closer to the biblical law than with secular law, meaning it's a law that tells you how to treat your wife and how to get married and divorced and how to say your prayers and how to wash yourself properly for ablution, for prayers and whatnot, as well as what happens when there is a crime and whatnot. So it's a law that includes ethics and what we may call both positive law of what one ought to do, the specific things that one ought to do. So there's this religious law, and then there are other things such as spirituality. Of Sufism is usually one discipline where spirituality, of Islamic spirituality, is discussed. All of these things are learned by scholars. Some people, of course, specialize, and then once you've gone through that process of learning, then you argue. So argument on the basis of evidence from scripture is how you prove yourself to be a worthy or competent scholar. So you can have somebody who is a very significant scholar in their field, or they are seen as great sheikh or great authority, and somebody, in fact, that has happened, and you can in fact see that today. Somebody converts to Islam, or somebody comes from Islam from outside, and they learn and master the sources, and they can argue with and disprove the points made by these long-standing authorities. So in that sense, there is truth doesn't trickle down. Truth is discovered, if you will, in the texts and in argument. And that's why there is you cannot be too certain about answers to specific questions in Islam. And that is the job of scholars, to know what we are sure about and what there is okay to disagree on this issue, and it's okay to disagree this much on that issue. There's a great Jewish scholar at Harvard University, Aaron Zaiso, who wrote his book, which is a really famous and popular book on Islam, and it's called The Economy of Certainty. I'm going to write that name because it's going to sound a little strange to your ears at first. It's not the economy that we're familiar with. It's called the economy of certainty. And that's how he defines Islamic scholarship, meaning that there is a certain amount of, what you have in the economy is you have a certain amount of resources, and they are, you have to economize them. You cannot spend too much and you don't spend too little. That's the idea of the economy. The same thing in Islam. When you are making an argument about, oh, this is what Islam says about X, Y, and Z, you have to you cannot overuse your authority. You cannot say that I'm absolutely certain about this if you're not certain about this, because that hurts your economy. So there are things about which all Muslims agree that are very few, but they are still, you know, they're substantial in number, such as 5 prayers and fasting and fasting and alms and all that. And that charity is good, and one ought to be good to one's parents, and one ought to worship God and love God, and so on and so forth, love neighbor. But there are many things on which Muslims will disagree, on details of how to offer prayers. People are going to disagree on whether, well, people are going to disagree about policy, but even on religious matters, they're going to disagree on whether, so for instance, on the issue of, is it permissible for women to lead prayers? Majority of traditional Muslims scholars have said that women do not lead prayers in public spaces, right? But some are beginning to say, no, they can. That's an exceptional opinion, but that's the kind of disagreement that is possible based on this interpretation of texts. So it's a democratic process, and it is a messy process. Now, to give you one example of how this kind of difference tends to be both good and bad for Muslims, it's just different. So after 9/11, I was engaged in talking to Christian groups, Jewish groups, other groups, talking about what Islam says on this or that issue. And often this would be asked, and it was all over in the media, it would be asked, why do Muslims not simply excommunicate these terrorists? Why don't they just say that Osama bin Laden is not a Muslim? Or things of that sort. Like, why can't you just go have somebody, a Muslim who represents all other Muslims, declare that this is not only wrong, because everybody said it's wrong, but that it is absolutely outside, that person who does such things, Osama bin Laden, is a non-believer and going to hell. Well, so first of all, the idea of who's going to hell, who's not, is something that we can only guess. But the real problem, or one major problem with this question, is that it assumes that there is a central structure like the Catholic Church. But Islam does not have a Vatican. There is no one authority that speaks simultaneously for all Muslims. And this means that opinions of what on any new issues, any new problems, take sometimes a generation, sometimes 2 generations to develop. Now, this means that Muslims have more of a room than, say, somebody who follows the Catholic Church, more of a room to disagree about specific issues until there is a semblance of agreement reached. And it's a messy process. It allows Muslims to try out different things, people to have different opinions, but it also becomes messy when you want things to change quickly for political reasons and whatnot. I guess one advantage of that is that it's really difficult, if not impossible. Well, nothing is impossible, but it's very difficult to politically manipulate Islam, because you cannot just take one man, one mullah, and say, you know, this person, put a gun to their head or give them a lot of money and say, you tell us, you tell everybody this is Islam. Well, you can do that, but they don't have all the authority, and sooner or later somebody's going to challenge their authority if they lose it. So that's the nature of authority in Islam.
Thank you very much. I think you've answered a number of questions there.
Well, thank you for asking. It's a wonderful question. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. So what I wanted to do now is just talk a little bit about the Islamic societies in the past before we get to the present in the last hour. And this is going to be relatively short, but today, if you look at Muslim societies or Muslim majority societies, so you look at, you know, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, Iraq, even Iran. Iran is the of these. Iran is a Shia country. The rest of those are Sunni. Nearly all of them have significant Christian minorities and significant Jewish minorities. Historically, Syria was up to 15% Christian. Egypt has 10 to 15% Coptic population, Coptic Christians, and a large number of Jews as well, who after the state of Israel was established, many of them have moved to Israel, so those populations have dwindled. But historically, the Muslim world was different from, let's say, the comparable Christian world. Christendom was different in that there were no significant minorities except for the Jews. And Jews were not integrated into the society. They lived as, if you will, on the margins as sort of functional groups that provided certain services, but are separate from the main society and are in a somewhat of a hostile relationship as just a different group. That was not the case in Muslim societies in the medieval period until the beginning of the colonial period, the 19th century. You have in the Muslim world significant non-Muslim populations that included Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Hindus. Hindus in India, Zoroastrians in Iran or Persia, and Christians and Jews in the Middle East. And they not only continued to live there, but they actually were integrated in the society and continued to prosper. So for example, much of Jewish theology and Jewish law, Jewish philosophy developed within the lands of Islam because Jews were free to integrate. And they, instead of sort of professions that were sort of limited to a marginalized class, they were money lenders. That's the one thing that Jews could do in the Christendom. In the Muslim world, they were often scholars and they were physicians. So that was one thing that physicians and scribes. This is true of both Christians and Jews, but Jews tended to be physicians and scribes, and Christians tended to be traders as well as scribes. And the reason why this is an important difference is that Muslims do not or have not typically lived in Muslim-only societies. So that the idea of multiplicity of religion, there being more than one religions, is not strange to Muslim societies. So what has happened now, and that we're going to look at in the next hour, is an incredible intolerance that is sometimes displayed toward Christians. That is a modern political phenomenon. Many of these Christian groups have been there. They have been Christian longer than any Western form of Christianity. And they have not only lived in peace, they in fact have contributed centrally to Muslim societies. So you may be surprised that some of the earliest anti-colonial movements against British and French were led by Arab Christians. The modern Arabic language was revived by Arabic Christians. Even until today, Arab Christians remain vocal and among the leaders of the Palestinian resistance movement, for example, against Israeli occupation. It's Christians who continue to lead, be among the leaders, but also among the literators, the writers, the famous writers of the modern period are Christians. So, and oddly, that many of these Christians, if you were to go and talk to them in the 19th century, many of them would have memorized many parts of the Quran, not because they're Muslim, but because it's considered a literary masterpiece. So just as Muslims who were living in, I don't know, the Victorian age in England would know passages from the Bible, these Christians would know extensive passages from the Quran as part of their education. And so they are extremely literate Christians and Jews who formed part of a common public sphere.
Hello.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to call you today. I don't know if you heard, but I've got to be at a funeral.
Dan, you may want to put yourself on mute.
Yes.
Dan.
I need to ask you to change the date. One of our pastors was killed.
Oh, there. Okay. Now he's muted. I apologize.
Okay. He left us hanging.
Yeah.
So the point I was making was that the medieval Muslim societies or pre-modern Muslim societies were much more familiar with and comfortable with interaction with Christians than the other way around. You would find no Muslims in Christian lands, but you had many, many, many Christians in lands that were formerly Muslim because they are governed by Muslim. Which also means that, you know, if you can look at all the way back to 14 centuries and there are continuous dialogues between Muslims and Christians. And those dialogues sometimes are bitter and harsh, but they are bitter and harsh on both sides, meaning that Christians are not just sitting and taking it. They are being criticized and they're criticizing. Sometimes you find really, really compelling and strong arguments against Islam, against Muhammad in those writings. And then you find rebuttals to that. And you find, of course, among Christians who, there's a very large number of Christians, in fact, who in the medieval period, who would say that, yes, Muhammad was a true prophet, but he was a prophet for the Arabs. And so they found ways to deal with and live with that, either antagonistically or otherwise. So there are Christians today who say that, well, we are in our civilization, we're Muslim, our faith is Christian, but we subscribe to Islam as a civilization. We believe that that is a truer representation of Jesus and what he taught than what one sees in the West. You have some major Christian Arab philosophers who argue. So there is a lot of diversity that is left out in the common standard narratives. And there is a misunderstanding and sort of bullheadedness on both sides often. So for example, there was recently a problem in Malaysia. Malaysia is a Muslim majority country with a Christian minority. And one of the scandals that was going around in Malaysia at the time was that some deeply conservative Muslims were saying that they objected to Christians using the word Allah to describe God. And this is really odd coming from Muslims because the Quran is very clear that Christians, Arab Christians, in fact, have the same God. They use the word Allah. But in Malaysia, Muslims did what some Christians do in the United States or in the West, that, well, you know, Allah is not our God, he's some other deity, moon god or something else. Also, Muslims have their version of that as well, that, you know, don't call our God, don't call your God Allah, you keep your God and we have Allah. So you have these kinds of really major sort of misunderstandings that are quite common. When the Crusaders came to Jerusalem in the 12th, the end of the 11th century, 1099, the beginning of the 12th century Common Era, these were not seen by Muslims primarily as Christians. They were seen as Franks, because the Christians that Muslims knew were Christians who were Byzantine Christians that were known as Romans. And those had known Muslims for several centuries. They were empires that were rival empires, but they also had dealings, they had communication, and they understood each other. So the Crusaders were coming from far west. They're coming from what is now France and Germany, and some from England and whatnot. And these Western Christians, or which was known as the Latin West, Latin-speaking West, when they came, they went through what was at that time Constantinople. Today it's Istanbul, but Constantinople, and Christians in Constantinople saw Christians from the Latin West as barbarians, and they wanted them not to come and stay in their city, but go on to east, go get Jerusalem from the heathens. But basically, these Christians found, and you have these accounts in historical, like medieval accounts, that there are Christians in the Holy Land that have been living forever. And those Christians, in fact, the Crusaders not only did not recognize them as Christians, but in fact they massacred them along with Muslims, because they couldn't really tell the difference. They couldn't tell them apart. And even if they did, these Christians were happy to be where they were. They were living in the Holy Land as far as they're concerned. So when Saladin or Salahuddin retook Jerusalem, famously, he allowed those Christians who wanted to stay there, and those who left could leave with the property that they could carry. That was the how Muslims, you know, there were some bad times, there were good times, but that was the norm, that you let Christians be Christians. There were times of intolerance. There would be pogroms, or if you will, every now and then, you know, once a century, you would have some Christian insult the Prophet Muhammad. That was a big deal. And when that happened, there would be tense relations, but they would be tensions like we have tensions in America today between various faith or race communities. It does not mean that Christians didn't belong there. It just meant that those differences were there and they were managed. They couldn't be eliminated, but they did not lead to intense persecution or Holocaust or genocide or elimination. It meant that people of different faith could live and manage their relations. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of medieval period. If there are no questions about this, I can move on to I haven't talked about jihad, so that's something perhaps I should talk about before we break this session, and when we come back, we'll talk about more modern stuff. So the word jihad is, you know, obviously it's very, very polarized word, and it is literally, its meaning is not really disputed by anybody, not Muslim scholars and not Western scholars who study Islam. It means struggle, and struggle for the sake of God. And today, Muslim apologetics, right, would argue that it is always peaceful. But of course, that's not the case. That's factually not the case, because jihad means struggle, and struggle is sometimes armed struggle. But the highest form of jihad is not armed. The highest form of jihad is not fighting in a battle. Highest form of jihad is either internal struggle of against your own lust and temptation, to overcome your own evil from within. That's the Prophet Muhammad said, and the Quran teaches that that is the real jihad. And there is a tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that he came from a battle back, and when going into prayer and remembrance, he said, we're coming from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad, that this is the real jihad that you have to do. Now, people dispute whether this is an authentic tradition or not. I'm not going to go into that, but it's most likely not authentic as an anecdote, but its spirit is true, because you find that in many other traditions and the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad said that the highest form of jihad is to speak truth to power, especially in a situation when you think you will be harmed, you'll be killed. So speaking truth to power when nobody else is talking, that is the highest form of jihad. And that is, not armed. That is journalism. That is investigation. That is political struggle. That is social justice. When I was an undergraduate, one of the things that struck me was how the narrative about Islam was changing. When I was an undergraduate at University of Wisconsin-Madison, we used to have a professor who taught world religions, and he had this knack for studying religions for a long time and then boiling them down to one word. And he would just teach that one word for every religion. So when he taught Judaism, he said, it's about community. The Judaism is community. And when he taught Christianity, he taught charity. He said, Christianity is about charity. And when he taught Islam, he taught justice. He said, Islam is about justice. And that struck me because as somebody who grew up as a Muslim, I recognized deeply with what he was saying, because that's how Muslims talk. That is social justice, political justice, but justice is what Muslims stand for. Now, that narrative has, it's surprising today because that has changed. But jihad is essentially in service of justice. Jihad is struggle for God in order to end oppression and in order to bring God's message. So it's to spread religion, but not coerce people to faith. So not coercing people into one's faith, that is a commandment in the Quran. That the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion. So jihad then is armed struggle that seeks to defend faith, that seeks to defend one's property and wealth, but does not seek to coerce people. And this bears out historically, because most people that converted to Islam in the societies, Syria and Egypt and Iraq, Many of them were earlier, they were Christian, Zoroastrian. Many people who were Christian, of course, remain Christian until today. But these Christians did not convert at the time of the conquest. So we have fairly solid historical evidence that these societies remain Christian or whatever other religion they had. There were different kinds of Christianity. There were Monophysites, and there were Nestorian Christians in Iraq, and Monophysites, Jacobian and Coptic Christians in Egypt and Syria and whatnot. So they remained what they were for 2 centuries after Islam came. And most of these people began converting to Islam en masse at a time when Muslim empires were, one could argue, secularized. That in fact they were not, if they had been force converted or converted at a time when there was great incentive to, they would have converted right in the 7th century, but most of them converted in the 9th century or 10th century. In fact, there are some recent works, historical works, that show that many communities remain Christian until much later, even a couple of centuries after that. So this idea that that Muslims went and force converted people to Islam is not true. It is true that Muslims were instructed to fight back if there was injustice, and if they were not allowed to practice their faith. And Ad, you're right to bring up those things. So there's tax codes that contributed, but they're often misunderstood. So let me talk about the tax codes, and I'm going to talk about Sufi saints later. So the deal for non-Muslims in Muslim lands is, it's called the status that they have, the legal status that they have, is something parallel to in the United States. You have permanent residence, that you have a zimmi status. The zimma means that you're going to pay a poll tax which is not applied to Muslims. And that poll tax is per person. Every person is going to pay this much tax for protection. Now, it's strictly and specifically for protection. The reason is that Muslims, when Muslims conquered lands of Syria, against Syria, Iraq, and those lands all the way to Persia, Muslims are warriors. They are the military, and they are doing the protection. And the local populations that are sitting in their own lands and producing, they're the ones who are producing agricultural output. That is the whole wealth. All of the wealth in the empire and the caliphate comes from agriculture. So if you were called to service, if you were doing the protection, you couldn't till the land. So those who were tilling the land and not participating in the military, they had to pay the poll tax. And the reason we know this is that because we have evidence, we have some cases when some Christians came and said, you know, we will fight with you and not pay poll tax. And the second Caliph Omar famously allowed them to do that. Well, if you're gonna take part in the defense, then you don't have to pay the poll tax. Muslims also pay a tax, but that tax is wealth tax, and that tax could be more than the poll tax. So that is something that people often don't understand, that, you know, there's poll tax is not always a disincentive, because it's a fixed amount per person, whereas wealth tax is a percentage of your wealth. So if you are a rich Christian, you're better off paying poll tax than paying your wealth tax that Muslims have to pay. All right, the wealth tax is alms, the zakat, which is one of the pillars of Islam. On the question of Sufi saints, yeah, so saints, they certainly played a role, the idea of holy men, and Muslims and Christians often shared spirituality. We have evidence of shrines where both Muslims and Christians would visit the same shrine, the same dead saint becomes the center of veneration for both communities. So these are some snapshots from the medieval period before the 19th century. So now we'll take take any questions if there are any, and then we can go into the modern period. Be about 5 minutes for questions if there are any.
Do we have any questions? Doesn't appear to be.
Okay. We could take our break a little earlier and come back at 11:35.
Maybe we should keep.
Sure.
Do we need a break?
Well, my dog needs to go potty,
Okay.
but you can carry on if you can wait for me to.
11:35 then. See you.
Okay.
I think there's one question, even though I'm not darling to say that.
Dan, I have a question. Overmere, I have a question.
So does Jim. There's two questions.
Right, I think that there are. Right, so Marion, thank you for your comment, but it's not a question, right?
There's Jim Hutchins and Doug Ritchie.
Right.
Go-
So, Jim, shall we begin with you? I could just read your question if that's what.
There's no questions written, just asking the question.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong, but did not the French and English decide to create modern Arabic countries by partitioning what was Arabia with little regard to people living in those areas? Absolutely. And that's where we're going into now. So we'll take first Doug's question, if that's
Thank you.
okay. Yeah.
I just had a question. With you being a Muslim born and raised in the United States, what are your thoughts on some Muslim communities that seem to be pushing for a Sharia law over legal law?
Ah, right. Interesting question. You know, the truth is that so there has been. I teach Islamic law in the law school here, and one of the things that's absolutely clear is that in the United States there is absolutely no way in hell that any other law but American law can prevail. So there is no such thing as Sharia law being pushed in America. It is absolutely a hoax. What you do have is mediations, private mediations or communal mediation. So for example, Jews have something called Beth Din in New York. Orthodox Jews, to ratify their divorces and marriages, would first go to their rabbis, who will often either resolve problems outside the court as in private mediation. Now, my wife happens to be a lawyer, so she does a lot of this, where there are people who will want mediation outside the court. In most cases, that is a good idea. Everyone, especially in civil matters and family matters, everybody recommends that. So in cases like that, where the American law allows people to reach mediation, that could be done in however people want to do it. So when the Jewish law, the Jewish community, Beth Din, uses their Beth Din, they're not sort of going against the American law, but rather they're working within the law in sort of in the domain of mediation and private contract. So what some Muslims wanted, and I think that's a really good idea to save legal costs, is to have something like Beth Din for Muslims, where when it's a matter of divorces or child custody, then the religious considerations, if both parties are religious and are willing to live by that, then that can happen. That, in fact, is a great cost saver and is generally recommended by the legal communities. All lawyers will tell you that this is a much cheaper way and much more cordial way of resolving problems, because when you go to the court, you have to make your case, you try to win, and that often means that that has a really bad effect on both parties and the children. So that is the extent to which people want to apply and want to bring in private matters Sharia law. But as far as the Sharia law itself, no, absolutely, there is no movement for it, and there is no room for it in American law. Absolutely.
Thank you. It clears up a lot, at least for me.
Thanks for the question. So let me now go to the United States, right? America and the relationship of the United States to the Muslim world. The 19th century, we're going to start a little bit way back, but I think that the reference that Jim, that you made already correctly, the countries, Muslim countries that you see today were created by French and British colonizers. The British colonized much of the Muslim world, stretching from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, all the way to India in the 19th century. As we know, the British Empire was the greatest superpower in the world in the 19th century. Sun never set on the British Empire, as it was said. And next to British Empire, the next competitor, not quite as big, but were the French, who wanted some piece of the Levant, some parts of Syria. And they were, there was, the 19th century was a century of the great game. So there were a number of empires. There were the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire, and Habsburg Empire in Eastern Europe. And then there was the Ottoman Empire, that was the Muslim Empire, which was called the sick man of Europe because it wasn't able to catch up and was defeating, was suffering from military defeat. So that's the 19th century for you. There was, in what is today India, subcontinent, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, they were part of the British colony, which was known as the Mughal India or British India. It was a century earlier, another Muslim empire, the Mughal Empire, which in the 19th century had become part of the British colony. So all of the Muslim world, with a couple of exceptions, was colonized throughout 19th century and early part of the 20th century. Until 1950s, the entirety of the Muslim world, with a few exceptions, was colonized. The only exceptions were the lands that were too backward to colonize. So Saudi Arabia today was a land that was mainly desert, and the British saw no point in colonizing it until oil was discovered, and that changed the politics. Iran was not colonized directly by the British, but it was divided between the British from the south and Russians from the north. So it was colonized, but not directly, because it's a rough land and nobody wanted to go and colonize it. So, and Morocco all the way in North Africa. But apart from these, the whole of the Muslim land, which means that you are talking about conditions in which Muslims do not control their fate. Muslims do not control how they live. their lands are being exploited, and their raw materials are flowing out to Europe, and products are coming back from Europe that are destroying local industry and local societies. And sometimes, often there are wars. So for example, in those wars, there is a draft, and Muslim young men are being drafted into British and French armies. So you can imagine this is a very different world, and one that Americans can only, I mean, it's a very distant memory for Americans to think about the British colonizing and British colonizers and whatnot. But even at that time, the Americans did not quite face the same circumstances. So this was, in Muslim language, this was known as slavery. So Muslims felt that they were enslaved by the Europeans. And this was the case until 1950. So the language that the Muslims used to get back their freedom was the language of freedom from slavery. But also, the language that Muslims, these occupied Muslim lands, and they were not only Muslim lands, of course, the Africans, the Indians, the Chinese, all of them had to face this colonialism. There's a big transformation that's taking place in the 50s. And what's happening in the 50s is the United States is stepping in after the Second World War, because the British and the French are destroyed and are unable to control the world. They're trying to, but the United States and Soviet Union are kicking out the old world powers. As the new world powers, the United States and Soviet Union are stepping in. So that's the world in the 50s. So when you think about the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, the United States engagement with the Middle East and the Muslim world, not just the Middle East, but the Muslim world in general, is very, very different. And one key moment in that relationship is the First World War, when the United States reluctantly steps in, and Woodrow Wilson famously presents his 14 points, where President Wilson's 14 points that emphasized independence and self-determination of all people. And that meant that Muslims across these colonized and enslaved lands saw America as the good power, as Americans, as those people who understood freedom, they understood rights of people, and they were with us, they were with the oppressed against these old powers, British and the French. Now, of course, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were completely ignored, including by the United States Congress itself. But that was the image of Americans in the Muslim world for much of the first half of the 20th century. The Americans are hardworking, they're smart, they have good technology, they come and they keep their deal. When they come to, for example, build infrastructure in your country, they will do so and leave rather than colonize it. And this is the reason why when oil is discovered in Saudi Arabia, it's discovered in Iraq and later in Saudi Arabia by the British explorers, but it isn't pumped until later. Long story. But 1945, when that happens, the Saudis go to Americans rather than the British to come build our oil infrastructure. And that's the reason why Saudi Arabia is United States' longest ally in the world today. And 1950s, beginning of the Cold War, 1953 in particular, things began to change. And the first major change came in Iran when basically what happens is Iran is seen by the British as their sort of golden goose. They want to keep, they can't really maintain their forces, but they want to control Iran's oil and tobacco industry. And that meant the people locally felt exploited. if you look at the deals that were made, only pennies pennies in a dollar would go to Iran, and the rest of the money flowed to Britain. There was protests all over Iran, and a democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, is elected, and he wants to nationalize oil industry. And the British go running to the United States. The CIA steps in, and basically not knowing much about the world, not knowing much about the Middle East, the American intelligence comes from Britain, and basically United States ends up stepping slowly into or filling those shoes of colonizers in the Middle East, sometimes unbeknownst to them. But what happens is the CIA comes and says, we need Mossadegh, we need this guy gone. So this democratically elected prime minister is ousted by the CIA through internal conspiracies. And that leads to a 20-year absolutely dictatorial iron fist rule of the king, or he was a military dictator who called himself King, Reza Shah, who is in the United States' back pocket. And that leads to intense hatred of the United States in Iran. Now, of course, American people don't know much about Iran, and they don't probably know what has been done. But this means that 25 years later, in 1979, there is an Iranian revolution against a dictator whose secret service is one of the most brutal in the world, and the reaction is against the United States as well. In 1979, slogans are chanted, "Death to America, death to America." Well, it's death to America because this is the context of it. Now, there is all of this comes to Americans' attention, not because it's a policy discussion, but because of a bunch of angry students in Iran surround and then raid American embassy in Tehran. That is when Americans know something is happening. And all they see is angry, shouting Iranians who are saying, death to America. Like, why are these evil people doing this absolutely nonsensical thing? These people are kept in captivity. They're treated well, but they're kept in captivity for about 400 days and then returned. But that turns American opinion against Iran. So that's, if you will, the first major introduction to the United States in the Muslim world in a new capacity as one of the world's two superpowers. And the effect of this is somewhat limited, meaning that Iran, this is happening in Iran, and other Muslim countries are also that are afraid of Iran's Islamic revolution, so that they ally with the United States, at least their dictators. So the Arab dictators ally with the United States against Iran's Islamic revolution, thinking that Iran wants, and Iran was saying that they want to take over the whole Muslim world. It was just empty slogans, but nonetheless, that is why the rest of the Muslims are somewhat less affected by the United States, what the United States did. It was bad. It was certainly a red signal that that you can just go and change governments this way. But that became the modus operandi of the United States, of CIA, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Almost in every single of these newly liberated Muslim nation states, United States is in CIA, rather, I should say, is engaged in regime change operations in Lebanon, in Syria, in Pakistan, in Iraq. In fact, in Iraq, the guy the CIA chose to engage in this sort of coup was none other than our Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the CIA's point guy who failed initially, and then later, a few years later, he was put in place. So my point is that and this is all Cold War politics, by the way. This is all the United States wanting to ensure that no leftist government takes power in any of those countries. And that is what leads to slowly a more skeptical attitude toward the United States. But it should be the main narrative is in every Muslim country, in every Sunni Muslim country, the only exception is Iran, the main narrative is that United States is good compared to Soviet Union. So we are on, why? Because the United States is God versus this godless atheist. That was how the Cold War was presented to traditional societies like the Muslim world. And so the United States in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, promoted and financed Muslim groups, Muslim militant groups, against Marxist groups, against leftists. So many of the Islamists, including the Taliban and the Afghan Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda, were all directly or indirectly on CIA's payroll. In fact, I remember when I was going to college in the 90s, late 90s, I just dated myself, in the 90s, you could have preachers from the Muslim world come to our mosques in university campuses and ask people, I'm talking early 90s and certainly 80s, this was the case. 80s was the height of this. They could come to recruit people to go make jihad. Why? Because the United States was 100% behind the jihad in Afghanistan, right? For those of you who don't know or don't remember that, but Afghanistan was seen in the United States by the US policymakers as the Vietnam for Soviet Union. We had lost in Vietnam, we had to give Vietnam to Soviet Union, and Afghanistan was that. Afghanistan was going to bring it down. So in 1979, the United States sort of invited Soviets into Afghanistan, which is right, obviously, in a neighbor of Soviet Union. So they baited Soviet Union so that they will be involved in this long war that will drain them. And it did. The people who paid the price for it were the Afghans, which was, Afghanistan was the poorest country on the list of countries in the United Nations. You look, the poorest country was Afghanistan in the world. It was a country that absolutely had nothing. I think less than 15 million population, most of it below poverty level. So these people then engaged in 15-year war against one of the superpowers in the world on behalf of the United States, on behalf of the CIA. The weapons are coming through Pakistan. So Pakistan is involved as the broker that strategizes the jihad, or the armed struggle, or the defense against Soviet Union. And the United States provides the arms, the military help, and financial help. And when there is not enough money available, CIA works with poppy fields. Afghanistan has poppy fields that makes absolutely the best heroin in the world. And when the Congress doesn't give you enough money, what do? You use heroin to produce the extra cash for the weapons. And this destroys Pakistan, because all of this drug flows into Pakistan and neighboring countries. But basically, Afghanistan is left in absolute devastation. And then Taliban are seen as a solution to that. Taliban literally just means students. These were students who were living on the border with Pakistan, of mujahideen, that is people whose fathers and parents had died in the war, and they are, they're living for 15, 20 years on the border. And that is the force then that Pakistan, with American help, grooms to go back to Afghanistan and to take power and to engage in power struggle, which various Afghan tribes were engaged in. So that is one way, one phase of relationship the United States has with Afghanistan and with the Muslim world. But even at this time, America is not seen as the devil by Muslims in general, except in Iran. So Iran is somewhat isolated. Otherwise, most Muslims are working with America against Soviet Union. So the US is on our side still, even though there is a great sense of exploitation and destruction that is being faced. Now, 1990, everything changes. 1990, 1991, that is when the first Gulf War happens. And the first Gulf War is, long story short, Iraq, who had fought against Iran. So I guess one other thing that's important in the 80s is that throughout the 80s, Iraq is led by our guy, Saddam Hussein. We put him there. That guy is attacked Iran as a punishment for Iran's animosity to us, but also because the desire of the neighboring Arab countries who are scared of Iran. So they are all financing, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait are all financing Iraq to find a war, to fight a war, unprovoked war against Iran. And Saddam Hussein, who is fighting this war, taking a lot of losses, is also developing his country, by the way. So Iraq in that time had one of the best education systems in the Middle East. It is using the money that is coming in as a result to develop its country. He is an absolutely brutal dictator, but he did have an infrastructure and the most advanced country in the Middle East. Iraq steps out of line, and Saddam Hussein, because of a dispute with Kuwait, which used to be previously a province of Iraq, he invades Kuwait, and the United States goes in, and that is the beginning. But in the process, the United States stations army in Saudi Arabia, and that is when Muslim world realizes that this is a different story now, because the Arabian Peninsula is considered sacred by Muslims. It's considered kind of like the Vatican for Christians, for Catholics, which meant that a large number of American troops in the Holy Land became the way that anyone who's any kind of anti-American could raise a lot of sentiment, could send waves through the Muslim communities throughout the world that the Holy Lands are now occupied by the Americans. So that is the first time in the 90s that the image of America from the good power changes to bad power. The Americans are there to take the Holy Land. And that is also when Islam is now seen as a danger. Remember, in the 70s and 80s, Islam is not only not a danger, Islam is a strength. And America and CIA, in fact, Jimmy Carter, President Carter, and his national security advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in 1979, wrote letters, and this is just a sample letter, but this is what's happening in the 70s and 80s, where they say, and I quote here, we see the Islamic resurgence as, that is jihad, as terribly important. It marks the rebirth of Arab vitality, which is the best bulwark against communism. So the letters are being written to Arab sovereigns that you should promote jihad among your people against communists. Islam is seen as good against communism. Right? That changes in 1990s, and it takes a long time to change. When in 1990s, this sentiment is building up. A whole generation is growing up thinking that what the U.S. is doing in Iraq is terrible. It's causing, and with Clinton administration, there are sanctions against Iraq, and those sanctions were just as devastating as the war. They looked peaceful, but in the end, they ended up killing, as the United Nations numbers have it, 2 million, over 2 million people, half 500,000 children. And that is a situation where extremism is born. That is the context in which Al-Qaeda is born. The word Al-Qaeda actually just means a database, like the database for your list, right? In your, you know, of who's going to show up at a party next time. You have a database or a list of people. It's just a database for all the people who had previously participated in Afghanistan. And basically, Bin Laden, who is an Arab son of this Arab billionaire or millionaire, begins to use that database to contact these people to come back and say that we need a jihad again this time, and this time the jihad needs to be against the United States to get them out of the Holy Land. That is when Al-Qaeda is born, in the 90s. So at first, Americans don't understand this. So if you look at the early analyses that are coming out in the 90s, 1996, 97, 98, they think it's Iran who's doing it, because the Mujahideen and these people simply were not against the United States, and they wouldn't act against the United States. So this is a new phenomenon that people are having trouble understanding. And then 9/11 happens. And then when 9/11 happens, that is when there's this, you know, the big public event that people understand that things have changed, that in fact, what has been done, for those who knew the past, right? Most Americans don't know the past, and their sort of imagination with the Middle East begins in 2001. But people who knew, they knew that what has been done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s has now come back to bite us. That we have created these terrorists, and these terrorists want, and it's a different kind of enemy. They don't have a country, that they are people in a new globalized world. They don't need to have a country, that they are operating from all these different places, and that's where the war and terror begins. And then, of course, there is an invasion of Afghanistan and invasion of Iraq, both of which lead to ultimately terrible failures. And here we are. But in this process, one thing that you will note is that Islam and Christianity are allied until the 90s against communism. And after, in the 90s, as the narrative is changing, the change is taking place within these Muslim countries as well. Because what is happening in Muslim countries, they're becoming split between the ruling class that is pro-United States but is suppressing their people, and the popular movements that are against the United States, and they are spreading. They are against the United States because they see the United States as supporting the dictators in each of those countries. And that was, in fact, the fact in 2011, 10 years later, something even more significant than 9/11 happens, and that is the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring which is what I'm going to end my talk with. Today. I'm sorry, I've gone over time, haven't I?
Well, you still have people listening, so.
Yeah, keep
Right.
going,
Well,
man.
right. Okay. Sorry. No, I'm terribly sorry. So what happens then in 2011, the Arab Spring? Millions of young people, in fact, millions of people, most of them are young, but can't come out in nearly 24 Arab countries, all the Arab countries and everywhere else that spills over, demanding democratic government. So one of the things that happens after 9/11, 2001 to 2011, is that people in the Middle East on the street have realized that the United States may be behind the problems. It is not the problem. The problem is their dictatorial governments. The problem is autocracy. The problem is the ruling class that is sucking their blood. And most of these are supported by the West, the United States, only because the United States is under the impression that that's the only way to keep peace in those countries. So keep feeding the dictators so that they will keep peace there, suppressing their people. And that is that's where the narrative sort of is today, that in the Arab Spring, the real struggle now is between autocrats in the Muslim world and the small class of crony capitalists that they support and they're supported by, and the majority of the people who have realized that the United States or the West are not the central part of their problem, that there is a lot of criticism of the United States as a political power, but there is an aspiration for American democracy, for American freedom, for American culture, for many parts of American life that are seen in the Muslim world as desirable. But what the autocrats, in other words, our politics and our values are at loggerheads in the Middle East. And the fight that we are seeing there in many ways is a reflection of this this struggle. What does it have to do with Christianity and Islam? Very little. But it gets fought under those labels. Thank you for staying and overstaying and to repay your kindness and patience for me going over by 10 minutes. I am going to let you ask any questions you may have for the next few minutes.
There is one on the chat, Oma, from Ed.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the Grand Mosque seizure of 1979. So that's reference to change within the Saudi ruling elite. So Saudis are a religiously ultra-conservative government. And it's made of an alliance. Saudi government is made of alliance between a religious family and a governing ruling family. Over time, what has happened is that the religious and ethical part of that alliance has been overwhelmed and dominated by the political part of that alliance. And those are the Saudis that give the name Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are becoming increasingly disconnected from their country, extremely corrupt. And as oil revenues are going down, there is a dissatisfaction that's boiling up. 1979 was the first manifestation when some religious Puritans rebelled and took over Kaaba. It was a really small time operation of a few young men with some grand ideas that they read in ancient books. So it was not really a major threat in terms of military or demographic, but it was dramatic because it took place in the holy place, the Kaaba. If it had taken place anywhere else, nobody would know about it because it's like a few dozen young men. Are there any Reformation movements in Islam as a religion? So that's an interesting and a really loaded question for people, because what does Reformation mean? If Reformation means the freedom of religious authority, then, well, you don't have any kind of sort of tyranny of the church in Islam to begin with. If what is meant is separation of religion from politics and secularism, then of course, yes, there are secularist movements, but often secularists since the beginning of the century have been allied to autocrats and not to democrats and liberalism or freedom. So there is a lot of complex movements that are going on. And there is internal religious reform movements, absolutely, since the 19th century. And they are more or less dominant, but there is no one single thing called Reformation. You have numerous Reformation. Remember, Reformation makes sense against a big, powerful, 1,000-year-old tyrannical church. But when you don't have that, then there is no reason or justification for one Reformation. What you have is numerous competing Reformation movements. But I think that if I could sum up the problem, the problem is ultimately political legitimacy. That suppresses any possibility of open discourse and debate on problematic interpretations of Islam or ultra-conservatism or atheism. All of these things are there, but there is, because there is an open debate, because of this political suppression, there is secularism or that is being imposed top down by the elite, and which makes people react. So lack of freedom and lack of political legitimacy, where public debate could take place, where universities could thrive and could have real academic debate, those conditions don't exist in many of those countries. Now, I don't want to generalize. There are places like Malaysia or Turkey or others that are better or in somewhat. Arab countries tend to be among the least free right now. Iran is boiling over. There is a lot of problems with Iranian clergy overplaying their hand, and they are certainly creating trouble throughout the region, trying to increase their influence. And unfortunately, United States missteps in 2003 in war in Iraq actually empowered Iran in a way that it was never empowered before. So that has led to a much more serious a war, if you will, because Iran is now able to create almost a bloc with Syria all the way to Lebanon, which is what it's trying to do. So there is almost an internal Sunni and Shia identity war. So these are not actually about Sunnism and Shiism, but Iran is trying to influence its power, increase its influence against Saudi Arabia. And the ruling elite in both powers are extremely unpopular and extremely selfish as far as their acts and values are concerned. But unfortunately, the United States has been deeply involved in, and often unknowingly, without knowing where this is going to go, coming in, not understanding the region. But that's where we stand. So the Middle East right now is in a very difficult situation, and without legitimate governments, it is not a good situation. That's.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if you see Brian's question there.
Do Muslim, Jews, and Christian leaders basically get along today, especially in regard to the Holy Land? Are there paths to peace among all of us? So I think that for most religious people, that's true when I talk to Muslims or Jews or Christians, it's a news that we may not like to hear, but faith doesn't really matter too much in the modern world. That people are not driven, policies are not driven by faith, certainly not by the values of faith. Politicians and capitalists tend to use religious identities for their benefit, and that's precisely why religious identities and boundary making is important, because that you can invoke in order to create a popular reaction, in order to find a common enemy. But as far as religious values are concerned, those are not in power, and I think that is a crisis. But I think that the Jews, Christians, and Muslim leaders are increasingly, scholars are increasingly in conversation with each other and finding common ground, realizing how faith has lost its blessing, its blessed role that it could play in the modern world. That as the world is secularizing, religion is not going away, religion is becoming more and more instrumental. So the short answer to your question, Brian, is yes, I think that we do get along much better today. There is more dialogue, but also there is realization that there is, that's not the real problem, that we need to work together to address some real problems.
Well, we want to thank you. I think we need to, we appreciate your time with us. I was supposed to be Bob Bottoms at this time, but he's not able to be here. I'm seeing the remarks, and we appreciate your comments, and we'll have to do this again. How would that sound?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It was lovely talking to all of you. Thank you very much for your patience and for such wonderful questions and engagement. Just elated that you reached out and did that. Not a lot of people are doing it at this time. And so this is a step in the right direction.
What I would like to close with is a benediction from Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who's was a while ago, but so here it is. May God give you grace never to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, grace to remember that the world is now too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. So may God take your minds and think through them. May God take your lips and speak through them. May God take your hearts and set them on fire. And so blessings
Amen.
To all of you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
All right. Oh. God bless you all. Such beautiful prayer.
All right. So hope to see you again. Blessings. Goodbye.